October 1917. The Chilwell National Shell Filling Factory, Nottinghamshire. A young woman named Dorothy Fletcher stared at her hands under the harsh electric lights of the washroom. The skin had turned a sickly, unmistakable shade of yellow. Not just her hands. Her face, her neck, every inch of exposed skin glowed with the color of a canary. She wasn't alone. Around her, dozens of other women examined themselves with growing horror, their faces transformed into grotesque masks of jaundiced yellow. But this wasn't a disease. This was poison. And it was spreading through Britain's munitions factories like wildfire, threatening to bring the entire war effort crashing down. On the Western Front, British artillery batteries were firing 18 million shells every single month. Every single one of those shells depended on women like Dorothy, women who packed them with TNT in vast industrial complexes across Britain. Now, those women were dying. Their livers were failing. Their blood was turning toxic. And if the factories stopped, the guns would fall silent. Britain would lose the war. What happened next was a desperate race against time, a scientific detective story played out in the shadow of catastrophe, where industrial chemists and medical officers fought an invisible enemy more insidious than any German weapon. This is the story of the Canary Girls and the men and women who saved them. The scale of the crisis became apparent on October 14, 1917, when Dr. Thomas Legge, the chief medical inspector of factories, received an urgent telegram at the Ministry of Munitions in London. The message was terse, almost clinical in its brevity, but its implications were staggering. Chilwell Factory reported 317 cases of toxic jaundice in the past fortnight. 17 women dead. Production capacity reduced by 40%. Similar reports arriving from Gretna, Pembrey, and Woolwich. Dr. Legge, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a reputation for unflappable professionalism, felt his stomach tighten. He had warned about this. For months, he had been documenting cases of TNT poisoning, but the scale had been manageable, isolated incidents that could be handled quietly. This was different. This was an epidemic. He immediately contacted Professor Arthur Harden, a biochemist from the Lister Institute who had been seconded to the ministry to investigate industrial hazards. Within hours, they were on a train heading north to Chilwell, carrying leather cases filled with chemical testing equipment and medical instruments. They had no idea what they would find, but they knew one thing with absolute certainty. If they failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. Chilwell was one of the largest munitions factories in the world, a sprawling complex of brick buildings and railway sidings covering nearly 1,000 acres. At its peak, it employed over 10,000 workers, the vast majority of them women. They had come from all over Britain, drawn by patriotic duty and wages that were better than anything available in domestic service or textile mills. They called themselves munitionettes. The newspapers called them the Canary Girls because of what the TNT did to their skin. When Professor Harden and Dr. Legge arrived at the factory gates on the morning of October 16th, they were met by the factory superintendent, a harried-looking man named George Macaulay, who had the exhausted appearance of someone who hadn't slept in days. He led them through the main gates, past armed guards and security checkpoints, into the heart of the complex. The noise was overwhelming. The constant clatter of machinery, the hiss of steam, the rhythmic thud of hydraulic presses. And everywhere, women. Women in white overalls and caps, their faces already tinged with yellow, moving between workstations with mechanical efficiency. Macaulay shouted over the din, "We're losing them faster than we can replace them." The hospital ward is full. We've had to convert 2 entire buildings into isolation wards. And the worst part, we don't know why it's suddenly gotten so much worse. That was the question that haunted Hardin as they toured the facility. TNT poisoning wasn't new. Trinitrotoluene had been used in munitions for years, and its toxic effects were well documented. But something had changed. Something in the process, in the environment, in the chemicals themselves, had transformed a manageable occupational hazard into a deadly epidemic. The filling sheds were where the work happened. Long, narrow buildings with rows of workbenches where women sat for 12-hour shifts, filling shell casings with molten TNT. The process was simple but dangerous. Empty shells arrived on conveyor belts. The women would position them under filling nozzles, pull a lever, and watch as the golden liquid TNT poured into the casing. Once filled, the shells were capped and moved to cooling racks. Simple, repetitive, deadly. Hardin watched the women work, noting every detail. The ventilation was poor, just a few windows at either end of the building. The air was thick with yellow dust, TNT particles that had crystallized and become airborne. The women wore thin cotton overalls, no gloves, no masks. Their hands were stained deep yellow, the skin cracked and bleeding in places. One woman, barely 20 years old, caught his eye. Her face was the color of a lemon, her eyes bloodshot and watery. She smiled at him weakly, then turned back to her work. She would be dead within a month. Dr. Legg began interviewing the sick women in the hospital ward. It was a grim procession of symptoms: nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain. Then the jaundice spreading across their skin like a stain. Their urine turned dark brown, almost black. Their stools became pale and clay-colored. These were the signs of liver failure, of a body overwhelmed by poison. One woman, a former schoolteacher named Margaret Seddon, described her experience with painful clarity. It started with the taste. Everything tasted metallic, like I was sucking on a penny. Then the headaches came, terrible pounding headaches that wouldn't stop. I thought I was just tired, working too hard. But then I looked in the mirror one morning and didn't recognize myself. I was yellow, completely yellow, like I'd been painted. Dr. Legg took notes, his pen scratching across the paper. How long had you been working in the filling sheds? 6 months, Margaret replied. But it got worse about 2 months ago. That's when I really started feeling ill. 2 months ago. Dr. Legg underlined the phrase. That timing was significant. Something had changed 2 months ago in August 1917. But what? Professor Hardin focused on the chemistry. He collected samples of everything. The TNT powder, the molten TNT, the air in the filling sheds, the water used for washing, the barrier creams that were supposed to protect the women's skin but clearly weren't working. Back in a makeshift laboratory set up in one of the factory's administrative buildings, he began his analysis. TNT itself was a relatively stable compound, but it wasn't pure. Commercial TNT contained impurities, other nitrated compounds that formed during the manufacturing process. Some of these were far more toxic than TNT itself. Hardin worked through the night, running test after test, comparing samples from different batches of TNT. And then, at 3 in the morning, he found it. One batch of TNT, delivered from a factory in Scotland in early August, contained unusually high levels of dinitrotoluene, a precursor compound that was significantly more toxic than TNT. It was more easily absorbed through the skin, more damaging to the liver, and it had been used in massive quantities over the past 2 months. Hardin sat back in his chair, exhausted but triumphant. He had found the smoking gun. But identifying the problem was only the first step. Now they had to fix it. The next morning, Hardin and Legg presented their findings to a hastily convened meeting of ministry officials, factory superintendents, and chemical suppliers. The atmosphere was tense. The implications were enormous. If the contaminated TNT was the problem, then it needed to be removed from circulation immediately. But that meant shutting down production at multiple factories, destroying thousands of tons of TNT, and potentially leaving British artillery batteries without ammunition. A ministry official, a gray-haired man with a clipped military bearing, voiced the concern that everyone was thinking. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your findings, but we cannot simply halt production. The army is consuming shells at a rate we can barely sustain. If we shut down even one factory for a week, we will have a crisis on the Western Front. General Haig's offensive depends on continuous artillery support. Without it, men will die." Dr. Legg responded with quiet intensity. "Men are already dying, sir. But they're dying here in Britain, in our factories. These women are not soldiers, but they are casualties of this war just as surely as any man in the trenches. And if we do nothing, we will lose them all." The room fell silent. The solution they developed was a compromise, a carefully balanced plan that addressed the immediate crisis while maintaining production. First, all contaminated TNT would be quarantined and tested. Any batches with high levels of dinitrotoluene would be diluted with purer TNT or reprocessed to remove the impurities. This would take time, but it was necessary. Second, factory conditions would be dramatically improved. Hardin had identified that poor ventilation was making the problem worse. The TNT dust and fumes accumulated in the filling sheds, creating a toxic atmosphere that the women breathed for 12 hours a day. New ventilation systems would be installed immediately, powerful fans that would draw the contaminated air out and replace it with fresh air from outside. Third, protective measures would be enhanced. The thin cotton overalls were useless. New overalls made from tightly woven fabric that TNT couldn't penetrate would be issued. Gloves would be mandatory. And most importantly, a new barrier cream would be developed, one that actually worked. Professor Hardin partnered with a chemist named Dr. Harriet Chick, one of the few women working in industrial chemistry at the time. Together, they formulated a cream based on zinc oxide and lanolin that created a genuine barrier between the skin and the TNT. It was simple, inexpensive, and remarkably effective. But perhaps the most important change was the rotation schedule. Dr. Legg had observed that the severity of poisoning correlated directly with the length of continuous exposure. Women who worked in the filling sheds for months on end accumulated TNT in their bodies faster than their livers could process it. The solution was rotation. Women would work in the filling sheds for no more than 4 weeks at a time, then be rotated to less hazardous work for 2 weeks, giving their bodies time to recover. This required hiring more workers and reorganizing the entire factory system, but it was the only way to prevent chronic poisoning. The plan was ambitious, expensive, and logistically complex, but it was approved. On October 23, 1917, the Ministry of Munitions issued Emergency Directive 47, mandating immediate implementation of the new safety measures at all munitions factories across Britain. The race was on. The transformation of Chilwell Factory began within days. Construction crews descended on the site, tearing holes in the walls of the filling sheds to install ventilation fans. The roar of the fans, when they were finally switched on, was deafening, but the air cleared almost immediately. The yellow haze that had hung permanently over the workbenches dissipated, replaced by a steady flow of fresh air. Dorothy Fletcher, the young woman who had first noticed her yellow hands in October, was one of the first to receive the new protective equipment. The overalls were thicker, more uncomfortable in the heat of the sheds, but she could feel the difference. The TNT didn't soak through anymore. The gloves were awkward at first, making the delicate work of positioning shells more difficult, but she adapted quickly. And the barrier cream, applied thickly to her hands and face before each shift, created a slick protective layer that the TNT couldn't penetrate. For the first time in months, she felt safe. The rotation schedule was harder to adjust to. Dorothy had grown used to the rhythm of the filling sheds, the camaraderie of the women she worked alongside every day. Being rotated to the inspection department, where she checked finished shells for defects, felt like a demotion. But she understood the reason. Her skin was still yellow, her liver still struggling to process the TNT already in her system. She needed time to heal. Professor Hardin remained at Chilwell for 6 weeks, monitoring the implementation of the new measures and tracking their effectiveness. He kept meticulous records, documenting every case of TNT poisoning, every recovery, every setback. The results were dramatic. By mid-November, new cases of acute poisoning had dropped by 70%. The hospital wards began to empty. Women who had been on the brink of liver failure started to recover, their skin slowly fading from yellow to a more normal color. It wasn't perfect. Some women were too far gone, their livers too damaged to recover. Margaret Seddon, the former schoolteacher, died on November 8th, despite the best efforts of the medical staff. Dr. Legg attended her funeral, a small ceremony in a Nottingham churchyard. He stood at the back, watching as her family laid her to rest, and felt the weight of every decision he had made. She was one of many. By the end of 1917, over 100 women had died from TNT poisoning in British munitions factories. But it could have been thousands. The measures they had implemented had saved countless lives. The crisis at Chilwell had a ripple effect across the entire munitions industry. Other factories, seeing the success of the new safety measures, implemented them voluntarily. The Ministry of Munitions established a dedicated chemical hazards division, with Professor Hardin as its director, to monitor working conditions and investigate any future outbreaks of industrial poisoning. Dr. Harriet Chick's barrier cream became standard issue at every munitions factory in Britain, and later, in Allied factories in France and the United States. The ventilation systems designed for Chilwell became the template for industrial safety standards that would last for decades. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The women who worked in the munitions factories had been invisible, their contributions taken for granted, their suffering ignored. The TNT crisis forced the nation to confront the reality of their sacrifice. These women were not just workers. They were warriors, fighting a different kind of battle, facing a different kind of enemy. And they deserved recognition, protection, and respect. By the spring of 1918, production at Chilwell and other factories had not only recovered but exceeded previous levels. The new safety measures, far from slowing production, had actually improved efficiency. Healthier workers were more productive. Lower turnover meant more experienced workers on the floor. The rotation system, initially seen as a logistical nightmare, proved to be a blessing, preventing burnout and maintaining morale. The 18 million shells per month that British artillery batteries depended on continued to flow without interruption. In March 1918, When Germany launched its massive spring offensive, British guns answered with a devastating barrage that helped blunt the attack. Every one of those shells had been filled by women like Dorothy Fletcher, women who had survived the Yellow Peril and returned to their work with grim determination. Dorothy herself worked at Chilwell until the end of the war. Her skin never fully returned to its normal color. There was a faint yellow tinge that remained, a permanent reminder of the poison she had absorbed. But she wore it with a strange kind of pride. She had survived. She had contributed. And when the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, she stood with her fellow munitionettes outside the factory gates and cheered until her voice gave out. The story of the Canary Girls and the TNT crisis of 1917 is one of the forgotten chapters of the First World War. History remembers the battles, the generals, the grand strategies. But wars are won in factories as much as on battlefields. They are won by the people who make the bullets, fill the shells, and keep the machinery of war running. And sometimes, they are won by the scientists and doctors who fight invisible enemies, who solve problems that have no obvious solutions, who save lives in ways that will never make headlines. Professor Arthur Harden returned to the Lister Institute after the war and continued his work in biochemistry. He never spoke publicly about his time at the Ministry of Munitions, considering it simply his duty. In 1929, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his work on fermentation, but those who knew him understood that his greatest achievement had been saving the Canary Girls. Dr. Thomas Legg continued as Chief Medical Inspector of Factories until his retirement in 1926. He spent his later years campaigning for improved industrial safety standards and workers' rights, always remembering the women he had seen suffer and die in the munitions factories. Dr. Harriet Chick went on to become one of Britain's leading nutritional scientists, but she always kept a small jar of the barrier cream she had developed, a reminder of the time when chemistry had been a matter of life and death. The lessons learned from the TNT crisis had implications far beyond the First World War. The investigation methods developed by Harden and Legg became the foundation of modern industrial toxicology. The safety measures implemented at Chilwell set standards that were adopted worldwide. The recognition that workers' health was not just a moral issue, but a practical one, essential to maintaining production and winning wars, transformed labor relations and industrial policy. But perhaps the most important legacy was the acknowledgement of women's contributions to the war effort. The Canary Girls had proven that women could do dangerous, difficult work just as well as men. They had endured poisoning, injury, and death, and they had kept the factories running. After the war, when women fought for the right to vote, for equal pay, for recognition as full citizens, they could point to the munitions factories and say, "We earned this. We bled for this country, just like the men in the trenches," and no one could deny it. Dorothy Fletcher lived until 1973, dying at the age of 78. In her later years, she rarely spoke about her time at Chilwell. The memories were too painful, the losses too great. But she kept her munitionette's badge, a small brass pin that identified her as a war worker, in a drawer beside her bed. And sometimes, late at night, she would take it out and hold it, remembering the women she had worked alongside, the friends she had lost, and the strange, terrible pride of knowing that she had been part of something larger than herself. The TNT crisis of 1917 was a catastrophe that was averted, a disaster that was turned into a triumph through the efforts of dedicated scientists, medical officers, and the indomitable courage of the women who refused to give up. It is a reminder that history is not just made on battlefields. It is made in factories and laboratories, in hospital wards and administrative offices, by people whose names are rarely remembered but whose contributions shaped the world. The Canary Girls sang their song in yellow, and Britain listened. And because of that, the guns never fell silent, and the war was won.